Today, we've given John Putley the day off for good behaviour, and we have a real treat. We've got Marion Hill, who is going to be giving today's talk. So a little bit about Marion, in case you've not met her before. So Marion has been in the heritage sector for about 20 years, but she's actually been working as the Learning and Outreach Officer at Gloucestershire Archives as part of their Green Pledge project for the last 2 years or so. The talk that she's going to be giving today is going to be on the road to recovery, which is going to take us through the evolution in approaches to nature conservation from the 1800s to the present and how it played out in Gloucestershire. She's going to be focusing today on historic content, as the period from the early 1990s to today is going to be covered at an event called Restoring the Natural Balance. This is going to take place on our first Saturday of the month event, and that's going to be on the 5th of July. As always, this will take place at the Heritage Hub. It is completely free. You do need to book because they do get very busy with the talks. We will, I can see Marion has already popped up the link for that, so please do come and join us for that. Before we start, just a couple of the usual things just to note. First of all, we are going to be recording today's event. That will go up on YouTube in the next few days or so, and you'll be sent a link to that if you want to go back to it. But just to remind you, if you could please turn off your cameras, and if you could also mute yourself, just so we can get rid of just that little bit of distraction whilst Marion is giving her talk. If you do want to ask any questions, Marion would be delighted. Could I ask you to pop those into the chat facility? And then I'll be putting those to Marion at the end of the talk. So I'm going to pass it over to Marion. Thank you very much.
Hello, everyone. Thank you very much, Gemma, for the introduction. I think a couple of people are just joining now. Hello. With everyone being with a mute, I don't know if I'm talking to experts or not on subject, but if I am, bear with me. Working in education in the heritage sector means you cover all sorts of periods of history and all sorts of subjects. So I will do my very best for you today. And if there are questions that I can't answer, then I will find out and email the answers back to you. Okay. So as Gemma has said, the talk is called The Road to Recovery, and we'll be exploring Gloucestershire's conservation journey. As you said, I work on the Green Pledge project, which, if you haven't come across it, is a 2-year Heritage Lottery funded project to explore the archive material that we have here at Gloucestershire that would shed light on both Gloucestershire and South Gloucestershire's environmental history. And you can find out all about the project and how to get involved and listen to podcasts and so on via the Gloucestershire Archive website. So do have a look at that. So today's talk then, I'm going to break it down into 3 sections essentially. And I want to think about our sort of shifting attitudes to nature over the time period that you can see, and think about the broad developments that have taken place and how these have played out in Gloucestershire. So we're looking at the very beginnings in the 19th century up to the time before the war, and then looking at that post-war to 1990s period, and then touching on the 21st century, really quite brief there because, as has been mentioned, there's going to be a talk given on the 5th of July that will cover the sort of 1990s to the present in great deal more detail, and that's going to be given by Dr. Juliette Hines, who is Head of Evidence at the Gloucestershire Wildlife Trust. So I will make a start then. So I think this phrase gets bandied around quite a lot, that Britain is one of the most nature depleted places in the world. But I want to just think for a minute about what does that actually mean? What does that look like? Can we put that into hard numbers? Sadly, the answer is yes. But essentially, globally, not just in Britain, biodiversity is declining faster than at any other time in human history. But as I say, to put some figures to that, in the 50 years from 1970, there has been a 73% decline in the average size of monitored wildlife populations. And today, 1 in 4 plant and animal species are facing extinction. But to home in on Britain, we are in the bottom 10% globally for biodiversity. So only 53% of our original nature remains intact as compared with a global average of 79%. So we are way, way down on that global average. So it's not a great picture at the moment in Britain, but we are working hard to halt and reverse that damage. So just move on. Biodiversity, that's another one. I just thought we sort of get to grips with some of these words that are used an awful lot when people are talking about things environmental. What actually is biodiversity and why does it matter? So biodiversity, I put a little definition there. It's just one of several. There are many out there, but put simply, it really relates to the variety of all living things on Earth and how they fit together, how they're sort of interconnected. But the reason it matters is because it underpins healthy ecosystems. It provides us with essential resources like food, clean air, fresh water. The poorer our biodiversity, the worse our environmental stability and our resilience.
No,
So
it's not showing the presentation, does it mean?
Are you not seeing it? Hello? Is it not showing?
You're muted.
Oh, hi, Marion. Just to let you know that I can see the slides fine. I think there is one person who's just struggling,
Okay.
but Katie's just helping them. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. I will carry on then. So how did we get into this situation of being in the bottom 10 globally? I think it's worth just thinking about the sort of the bigger historical picture. The world has been here for over 4.5 billion years, continually adapting and evolving. Humans have only been around for roughly the last 300,000 years. But we've often acted as though we're somehow special, somehow separate from and above the natural world, rather than part of it. And it's an attitude that just ignores that idea I said about biodiversity, about that interconnectedness of all forms of life. And there are various ideas and explanations about how that sort of attitude, where did that attitude come from? Some people sort of believe that this stems from a rather over-literal interpretation of some Western religion texts, which talk about man's dominion over the earth. Now, does that mean control or does that mean stewardship? You know, it's open to interpretation, that word. But in a way, it's fairly academic. You know, it doesn't alter the bottom line, the place where we are. But I think when I look at it, I just think about when did the real damage start? We seem to live sustainably for centuries and centuries. I think you could argue that the damage really starts in the Tudor times, when Britain was laying the foundation for her empire. Now, at that time, we had a strong navy and a burgeoning interest in exploration and trade. But we did run into problems. In the 1530s, there were several poor harvests alongside a growing and hungry population. So the Tudors brought in a piece of legislation to try and improve food security, as we would think of it today. And that was the Preservation of Grain Act of 1532. Now, through this, a list of vermin were drawn up, and men, women, and children were rewarded with cash bounties for killing any of the animals on that list. And the Act remained in place for centuries, doing untold damage to wildlife, some of which was completely harmless. There were animals like hedgehogs on there, which didn't do any harm to food stores. But the Tudors believed that they drank the milk from cows in the night time, and so they ended up on the list. I mean, it was really just a superstition. It wasn't based on anything sort of serious at all. The Tudors also needed plenty of wood for building houses, bridges, furniture, all sorts of things that they were busy doing. So they need this steady supply of timber. And what that also led to was widespread deforestation. So you've got this attack on wildlife and an attack on the forests as well. So much so that in the early 17th century, there was an agricultural writer called Arthur Standish. Nobody's ever heard of him these days. But in 1611, he went around England and tried to assess the damage and try and find out how much usable forest was left, because these places were sort of stripped bare at that time. And he wrote to the king to set out the issues that he found. And I'll just give you a little quote from it. It says, "We do in all humbleness complain unto your majesty of the general destruction and waste of wood made within this your kingdom, more within the 20 or 30 past years than in any 100 years before. Little respect is taken, but your majesty, for the posterity and prosperity of your kingdom. There are too many destroyers, but few or none at all, plant or preserve." So he did also propose some solutions. He was a really sort of ahead of his time, should we say, but I can only recommend you look him up, Arthur Standish. But really, in a way, that was just the shallow waters compared to what was to come. Far, far more serious harm to nature was to come in the form of the Industrial Revolution. So, as you probably know, this is a period starting in the mid-18th century of major social and technological change. And it turned us from being an agrarian society into an industrial one, and marked the shift from sort of handmade goods to machine-made goods, and brought in steam engines and factories and so on. So everything changed after the Industrial Revolution, and it put a profound stress on the environment, on our natural resources and so on. And essentially, it's that level of damage, things had to get that bad before we really looked around and went, hold on, we now need to start thinking about repairing some of this damage. But just before we dive into that, I wanted to have a little look at that broader social picture in the early 19th century. And I think it's fair to say it's rather confusing. It's a time when we are both looking to admire the natural world, paint it, write poetry about it, things like the National Trust are getting created, but we're also seeking to order it and control it. So it's a very strange time, the 19th century. It's a time when we're beginning to understand how ancient the planet is. You've got Earth and life sciences just starting to sort of come into sort of to being, things like biology and paleontology, geology, ecology. These were all new sciences, and there was a huge expansion in our efforts to sort of inventory and classify the natural world. In 1859, you get Darwin's publication on the origin of the species, and that significantly shifted our perception of our place in nature, because he was demonstrating that we're part of the natural world. We're subject to the same evolutionary processes as other species. We are not, as some people might have taken it from the Bible, separate and above nature. So that sort of really altered people's thinking. There was huge fascination with natural history. This is the time when all the big museums were set up. But before that, there were private collectors gathering up all sorts of things in their cabinets of curiosity, things, that they'd imported from all over the world. But it also led to a fairly brisk trade in birds and eggs and taxidermy. So again, more damage to the natural world there. But really, it's this time when we began to see, literally, with our own eyes, what the Industrial Revolution is doing to our landscapes. So this is when the long road to recovery actually kind of gets underway. So what did we do? In the beginning, it's not, it's pretty slow, the start. To be honest, the 20th century is when things really get going. In the 1830s, you get the first sort of naturalist clubs and societies, and they essentially lay the foundations for modern conservation, because they are all about documenting very systematically and very precisely local flora and fauna. So in essence, they're creating a sort of baseline data as we would see it now. And we have various journals from this era, which are really fantastic here at the archives, and which help us paint that picture of what have we lost in that arc of time since the Industrial Revolution. So they're really interesting. But it's hard for us to imagine, we live in a time where you can point your phone at any plant, any animal, or wave at any bird song and instantly know what that is. But we're trying to get our heads into thinking about a time when you couldn't do that. People had to literally go out into the field and build that knowledge and help us all try and understand the natural world and sort of encourage careful stewardship of it. So nature reserves were another kind of leap forward, but in their first iteration, they get criticised later on as sort of fortress conservation. It was literally sort of building walls around areas and trying to sort of keep humans out. It wasn't a very complex or sophisticated approach to conservation, but it was a start. The first person who did that was a chap called Charles Waterton in West Yorkshire. A place called Waterton Park is believed to be the first nature reserve in the world. And he transformed the park that he inherited into this haven for native and migratory species, particularly birds. But very unusually, he didn't keep it to himself. It was essentially a sort of private collection, a private nature reserve, but he actually opened it up to the public. And in his wake, more and more nature reserves in the 19th and really a lot more in the 20th century were created by individuals or by charities. In the 1860s, you see the very first wildlife protection legislation. When you think we've been doing damage to nature for several centuries before then, that's quite late in the day. But the mindset just wasn't there up until then. Animals were just either to eat or to hunt, or to use for work. This notion that they were worthy of protection is a pretty late idea. So 1869, we have the Seabirds Preservation Act, and people were genuinely concerned about the obvious visible decline in seabird populations because of human activities, particularly egg collecting and hunting for sport. And so the Act protected 35 species of seabirds. Another really key figure in the early development of nature conservation was Charles Rothschild. And you may have come across the Rothschilds, they pop up in all sorts of places. He created 3 reserves on his own estate, but moving on from this idea of just protecting a species, he grasped the fact that that wasn't enough and that you needed to protect an entire habitat. So not just the species, but the species and everything it needs to nest, to feed, to be safe. So in 1912, he established the Society for the Promotion of Nature Reserves, and he compiled a list of getting on for 300 sites in Britain and Ireland that he thought were worthy of preservation. And he published that list in 1915, and he submitted it to the government to sort of with the aim of getting those places protected. And the Society for the Promotion of Nature Reserves eventually sort of evolves into what we know as today's wildlife trusts. But that's its foundations in the early 20th century. Wildlife campaigning, again, hard to imagine a time when we didn't have World Wildlife Fund and all these sort of various NGOs. That doesn't really get off the ground as an idea, people fighting for wildlife, until the 1880s, when the first campaign was an all-women campaign to try and stop people killing birds just for their feathers to be used in millinery and fashion, because it was driving birds like the egrets and grebes and various exotic birds who would have been killed and their feathers imported, just for use in fashion. So the campaign was run, as I say, by this small group of women, and they were They got together because they were frustrated the men weren't doing anything. They had made applications to the British Ornithologists Union, who was an all-male organisation, and they didn't do anything. So they got together, and their efforts culminated in the establishment of what we know as the RSPB. So that at that point, when it started, it was just the Society for the Protection of Birds, and that was 1889. It was founded, and it got its royal charter in 1904. And they were successful. I mean, it took nearly another, generation worth of time, but 1920s, early 1920s, the Importation of Plumage Prohibition Act was passed. So that didn't protect our birds, but it did stop us importing exotic bird feathers for just for the purposes of fashion. So that was huge leap forward. And then I just touched on earlier, the National Trust was established in 1895 amid the growing concerns around rapid industrialization and development and loss of landscape, change to the landscape and so on. And they were seeking to preserve places of historic interest, but also places of natural beauty for everyone. I think that's even still their sort of phrase now, is forever for everyone. So they've stayed very true to their mission. But I think these days their work has a more of an environmental slant to it. So, shall we be waiting to hear something about Gloucestershire? How did all this play out in Gloucestershire? Let's have a look at some actual archive records. So we certainly got in on the desire to know and understand the natural world fairly early on. The first naturalists society in Gloucestershire is the Cotswold Naturalists Field Club, and they were established in 1846. And what you're seeing there is the first minutes of their first meeting. And that was 7th of July, 1846. And they didn't seem to rush into things. They seem to have gone to the pub and looked out of the window, really. I'll read you a little bit because it's quite hard to see on the screen. It says, the first meeting of the club took place at the Black Horse Inn, Birdlip, where breakfast was ready at 9 a.m. On that occasion, only 7 gentlemen were able to be present. And after an ample breakfast, for which the keen air of the Cotswolds had prepared a favourable reception, the members adjourned to a summer house in the garden of the inn, commanding a splendid and varied view of the Vale and city of Gloucester, the town of Cheltenham, May Hill and the Malvern Hills. Such was the appropriate birthplace of the Cotswolds Naturalist Club, of which it was then agreed that 25 gentlemen should be its first members. It was also agreed that the object of the club shall be to investigate the natural histories, antiquities, and agriculture of the Cotswold district and its neighbourhood. Now, they weren't alone. Various other clubs appeared later on in the 19th century. We get the Cheltenham Working Naturalist Association in 61, Cirencester Naturalists and Archaeologists Club came in 96. But only a couple of them still survive today, the Cotswold Naturalists and a post-war organisation called the Gloucestershire Naturalists. But we were certainly in at the beginning with that. With all these clubs busy out there recording information, it's not surprising that fairly soon they were seeking to share that knowledge through publications. The main natural history publications that I would sort of flag up for this era are the Flora of Gloucestershire, for which work began in the 1870s. And you can see on the left notes by a Professor Bulger. That publication doesn't actually come into a print until much later, and we'll talk about that later. But it's a huge task trying to write down every plant of the entire county. But all the counties were doing it. This was quite a typical thing for the naturalist societies to do. And you can find parallel works elsewhere. The other one is about birds. It's a treatise of the birds of Gloucestershire, which was created by William Lochmellish and published in 1902. I've just put some of the plants that they're talking about and birds that they're talking about next to them. That's the curl bunting on the right, and can't quite read the sign for the other one. So what else? Arboreta. This was a great passion of 18th century natural history collectors. So alongside those naturalist societies, you've got individuals who were amassing private plant collections. And perhaps the first one that springs to mind is Westonbirt. Now that collection is really old. Work started in 1829 on that. So that was Robert Holford of Westonbirt. And he wanted to showcase rare and beautiful plants from all around the world. And when he died, his son George carried on developing and expanding the Arboretum. In fact, he did even more work than his father, I understand. But that remained in private hands until the 1950s, when the Forestry Commission took over. And in, I think, the early 60s, it was open to the public as the Westonbirt that you know today. But other private arboretums sort of sprung up elsewhere. There's one at Tortworth. It's much smaller and it's only open to the public on special event days. So that's much closer to this kind of 19th century idea. But the Holfords were at Westonbirt, they were on very good terms with the royal family. And in the planting record on the right, which is from Westonbirt, you can see a little note at the bottom of the page, which mentions Princess Victoria, which is one of Queen Victoria's children, having planted an acer there. So I'll just put a little picture of, there are obviously lots of different colours of acers, but possibly one like that. But you can go to Westonbirt now and try and find the one that she's planted. But on the left is an arboretum that never was, sadly. This is a proposal from 1836 for a zoological gardens and botanical arboretum in Cheltenham. And this is one of those projects that just founded perhaps due to being rather overambitious. They wanted a vast 16-acre site, but they ran into financial troubles. They ran into disputes between different parties who were involved. They couldn't agree on the location and so on. And the whole thing gently hit the buffers and never quite happened, which is rather sad. Nature reserves. We've touched on the fact that there was the very first one up in Yorkshire that was quite early. These are such an important part of our initial thinking about protecting nature, and really the cornerstone, as I said, for 20th century conservation. The first one in Gloucestershire is in Badgeworth, near Cheltenham, and it was created by a science teacher from Cheltenham College called Mr. Headley, and really it was a rescue job. He saw that this land was going to be built on, so he very swiftly bought it and presented it to the Society for the Promotion of Nature Reserves in 1933. And it's a good job he did, because it is a very, very special place. It is one of only 2 places in the UK that supports a population of rare adder's tongue spearwort. So this is also known as the Badgeworth buttercup. You might know it by that name. It's the buttercup that I actually see in the Green Pledge Project logo. So he did a really good thing, and the buttercup has survived to this day. So on the right there is a 1960s leaflet, which on its inside cover is highlighting that buttercup. On the left-hand side of the slide, there are some minutes from Gloucestershire County Council's Joint Planning Committee for the Forest of Dean. And they are discussing a proposal to have the Forest of Dean become the first national forest park, which it did in 1938. But the discussions in the minutes are all revolving around what impact this designation will have. And you might think, oh, good, they must be thinking about, the flora and fauna and all the rest of it. Alas, that somehow seems to have slipped off the agenda by the 30s. They are more interested in the forest park being a place that will encourage people to go on sort of outdoor holidays. It will support the kind of national fitness movement that was going on. They were a little bit concerned about the fact they would need additional facilities and accommodation for tourists, but the impact on nature and wildlife, it simply isn't there at all. But it returns later on, and we'll see that. So what else was the government doing or local government doing to protect wildlife? So we've got that central legislation about birds coming in the late 19th century, but it was down to the local authorities to actually identify the species in need of protection in their area. So the minutes that you can see, the handwriting on the right-hand side of the slide, that's from the Council's Special Committee for Wild Bird Protection of the 1890s. And they've invited, I don't know if you can see it at the top, I think it says Mellersh, they've invited the chap who wrote the 1902 treatise on the birds of Gloucestershire, because he was the birdman, he was the go-to guy for ornithology in Gloucestershire. So he's advising that council special committee about which particular Gloucestershire birds should be protected and what reasons. Now, if you're looking on a large screen, you'll be able to see that, but there are various things. Some he knows are already at risk of extinction, and so they're sort of listed for their rarity, but others reveal his understanding of ecology. He's talking about what these other birds can do in their environments, whether they eat insects or that sort of thing. So it shows that understanding. So ecology as a word was only coined by a chap called Thomas Haeckel in Germany in 1866. So he's on board with kind of some of the latest thinking, which is really good. And you can actually sort of see the proof of that in those minutes. Now let's have a look at some of the sort of conservation organisations, what was actually going on. So we know the National Trust was set up in 1895, and from that moment on, it began acquiring and protecting natural and historical places. And among its early acquisitions in Gloucestershire, you probably know Hidcote Manor and Snows Hill Manor. But here on the left is the paperwork or legal paperwork for the acquisition of Minchinhampton Common near Stroud. So this is a huge site. This is a 180 plus hectare site, and it's home to a vast array of flora and fauna. There are rare orchids. I've put one on there. There's the Duke of Burgundy butterfly. That's the butterfly on there. So that's a really wonderful place. And one of the best things I've seen in the archives is that a little notebook of a girl who walked across Minchinhampton Common in the early 20th century, and she's noting down all the wildflowers she sees, and the book runs into the hundreds. And I saw that book at the beginning of my time on this project, and now it all makes sense, realizing I didn't know that Minchinhampton Common was a National Trust place, but that little girl would have known already that it was a place where she could find all sorts of wonderful flowers. So there we are. So it all comes together. We know that Gloucester and Cheltenham had a branch of the RSPB that they formed in 1918, but sadly we don't have any records of those, so I can't show you those. But I did find some records from the Gloucestershire branch of the Campaign to Protect Rural England. So this was 1926. Was founded in 1926, and their real aim was to try and stop the unchecked urban sprawl that they could see going on, really just thanks to sort of the fallout from the Industrial Revolution, really. And they did things like advocating for greenbelt designation, that sort of thing. So people think that's a fairly new idea. It isn't. It comes from the late 19th century, from the founder of the Garden City movement, Ebenezer Howard. All of his designs had a green area all the way around the edge of them. So certainly something that seems to be somewhat under threat in our current world. But anyway, we were fairly swift to get our branch. It was 1928 that the Gloucestershire branch opened up. And on the slide there is an excerpt from the 1930 minute book. And the discussions there really are all about planning, town planning. It's an idea that was still pretty much in its infancy. And the group are discussing they want to support their being a town planning officer in Stroud. They clearly have an architects panel as part of the Gloucestershire group, and they are thinking about how they can kind of lend their support for the people who are developing new housing and sort of offering up the services of their architects panel. I mean, today, CPRE still exists. Gloucestershire's got 6 area committees of volunteers, and they spend their time sort of scrutinising applications and making representations if they think that any development would be particularly harmful in terms of its impact on the landscape and the natural environment. And I didn't get my hands on this book yesterday when I was trying to find it. It was because it's actually out on a temporary withdrawal with the Gloucestershire CPRE, who are writing a book about their history for their centenary in 2028. So you can look out for that in a couple of years' time. So let's move on and have a think about what happened. Obviously, the war is a huge watershed for so many different aspects of our lives, and certainly nature conservation is included in that. There is a piece of landmark legislation that was introduced in the post-war years, and that is the National Parks and Access to the Countryside Act. And as the name indicates, that led to the creation of national parks, national nature reserves, local nature reserves, areas of outstanding natural beauty, sites of special scientific interest. And this is really the beginning of the sort of the second phase of nature conservation. This is this sort of slightly more structured approach to nature conservation. So in 1952, we get the first 6 national nature reserves, and today there are more than 220 of them. What's quite interesting about the Act is it again gives powers to local authorities who can actually know what's going on in the ground near them. It's no good people in Whitehall deciding where to put local nature reserves. So the Act empowered local governments to designate local nature reserves. And by the 1990s, there were more than 560 of those. In the 40s and 50s, I think, yes, our shift in our thinking towards nature, you know, that shift was coming, but a lot of people were still thinking about all the issues that there were in the post-war years in relation to rebuilding bomb-damaged towns and cities, building new towns, you know, from scratch, rebuilding the economy, and so on. So, you know, that there wasn't that broad understanding and support of conservation and environmental issues that we have today. There were pockets of concerns about specific problems like air and water pollution, but not that broad sort of environmental awareness, not yet. But it was in the post, because in 1962, a lady called Rachel Carson, published a book called Silent Spring, which you may or may not have heard of. She was in America, but it was quite the wake-up call. Her book highlighted the detrimental effects of indiscriminate pesticide use, particularly DDT, on ecosystems and human health. And that really was the catalyst for the modern environmental movement, but it really doesn't really take off properly sort of late 60s, sort of 70s and 80s. But that's probably a good sort of turning point there. During that time, during the 70s and 80s, you see more NGOs forming, things like the World Wildlife Fund, Friends of the Earth, the I don't know if you've come across this organisation, the International Union for the Conservation of Nature. I hadn't, but they were people who published the first red list of threatened species. So we really had a total grasp of what actually needed our support and where, and that was a global list. You may be more familiar with the British Trust for Ornithology's red list, but that's of birds, birds only. But in the 80s, so you start to see this awareness and education about environmental issues starting to grow, and also the beginning of that critique of fortress conservation, which really sort of cut humans out of the picture. And there was a sense that was a bit simplistic, and didn't really take into needs the sort of take into account the needs of the communities around those spaces and the complexity of the relationship between humans and their environment. So it's also a time when volunteerism in conservation takes off, citizen science as well. So the real leap forward there in the 20th century comes quite late. It's the 1981 Wildlife and Countryside Act. And despite it being several decades old, this is still one of the most important pieces of legislation for wildlife protection in Britain. and it protects a huge range of wild animals and all wild birds. It also protects certain plants from being picked or damaged. But we had to wait nearly a decade after that for the most significant shift in our thinking, and that took place at the Rio Earth Summit in 1992. So that was a conference attended by nearly all the countries in the world, huge number, about 150 or so, not the United States, interestingly. And at that summit, those countries, 150 odd of them, signed the Convention on Biological Diversity. And that's important because it is the first time that we officially recognise the importance of biodiversity and start to make moves to halt and reverse the loss of biodiversity globally. And it essentially provides a framework for decision making and planning in relation to biodiversity issues. And the fallout from that here in the UK is that you get the Biodiversity Action Plan in 1994, and from that, local biodiversity action plans follow as well. So let's see what else happened. We mentioned in that sort of post-war years, you get the beginnings of national and local nature reserves. Down here in Gloucestershire, we have 12 national nature reserves, and on the slide you can see the Cotswold Commons and Beechwoods, which is one of the largest national nature reserves in the Cotswolds, and it's mainly made up of a chain of beechwoods and limestone grasslands around the upper slopes of the Painswick Valley. And the beechwoods themselves are particularly important because they support several rare species of spiders, snails and butterflies. In terms of local nature reserves, we've got even more. We've got 46 of those. And on the right-hand side of the slide, you can see the official designation for Cooper's Hill Local Nature Reserve near Gloucester. And that's an important one for ancient beech woodland and open scrub and grassland. Now, in those early post-war years, the renowned conservationist Peter Scott, who was son of Scott of the Antarctic, he really got about in conservation circles. If you start reading about post-war conservation, you'll see him in all sorts of places. And one of the things he did was to create a centre for the research and conservation of wildfowl in Slimbridge. And at that time, it was known as the Severn Wildfowl Trust. But like Charles Waterton up in Yorkshire in the 19th century, he was a bit of a maverick, and he also opened up his reserve to the public. So again, a move away from this idea of just them being sort of places where humans can't go in, that fortress conservation idea. It's a shift away from that. It wasn't until the late 80s that they changed their name to Wildfowl and Wetlands Trust, and today they operate 9 wetland sites across the UK, and they are a leading force in wetland conservation globally. So another one of these elements of that post-war legislation of 1949 was the creation of areas of outstanding natural beauty. And down here in Gloucestershire, we've got 3. There's the 2 that you can see on the slide, Wye Valley and the Cotswolds, but also the Malvern Hills. And ours was designated in 66 and 71, respectively. These days, though, they're known as national landscapes, and the focus, again, has sort of shifted since that time. There's much more emphasis on nature conservation, nature recovery, but they have to balance that very carefully with tourism. So we're now doing the balancing act better between the needs of nature and the needs of people. SSSIs, so sites of special scientific interest. So while the sites we looked at on the previous slide were really just about their natural beauty and creating places for people to enjoy as the initial idea, these were places that are of particular interest to science because of their wildlife or because of their geological features or their natural heritage. There are over 4,000 of them in England alone, and there are 121 of these in Gloucestershire. So I've just put one example there on the slide, which you probably have come across. Have you heard of the bats at Woodchester Park? There's one of the longest continuously running scientific studies going on there. It's been going on since 1959, the study of greater horseshoe bats. And if you're interested, they're still looking for volunteers, so you can join that and be, part of this kind of historic study of wildlife there. Right, so just move along. Research and publications. So you may remember when we were still talking about the 1800s, me mentioning the work on flora of Gloucestershire that started in the 1870s by Professor Bulger. Now that work finally was finished and went into print in 1948. And I can only imagine that is due to the complexity of the task. I know in some cases it was due to the people involved actually dying and the work having to be passed on to a new group of people. But perhaps it was also spurred on by the renewed interest in nature after the war. So you can just see the inside cover and illustration there. On the right-hand side, you can see an example of the kind of research that was going on in the post-war years. On that right-hand side is a 1966 ecological survey of Dean Woods in the Forest of Dean by a forester called Geoffrey Waygood. We have a huge collection about his work if you're interested. So you remember when we were looking at the 1930s slide about the Forest of Dean Committee, and they really didn't take on board any sort of environmental considerations when they were thinking about creating the first national forest park out of the Forest of Dean. Well, I can assure you that by the 60s, people like Geoffrey Waygood totally grasped that, and his survey is being done so that they can decide whether or not to make certain changes to an aspect of the forest. I think they're talking about changing it from what grew there naturally to a coniferous crop, because it's a working forest, the Forest of Dean. But Geoffrey was in there in the 1960s, busy doing his assessment of how that would impact the soil, how that would impact the vegetation, the animals and the birds and so on. So that's good to see, but it took, another 30 odd years to be thinking in that way. Conservation organisations. One of the first ones that popped up after the war was the Gloucester Naturalists I mentioned earlier. So they were founded in 1948 and very much on the same lines, but maybe with fewer breakfasts as the Cotswold Naturalists. They were about the systematic recording of the county's flora and fauna. And they also went on to do various publications, and they're still going strong, and they play a vital role in biodiversity conservation. So on the slide, you can see the work of one of the group's members, a chap called Charles Bannister, who was a leading ornithologist and botanist and member of the group. And we have his journals here that span the 1930s to the 1960s, and they are extraordinary. The wealth of information that you can get from that. He writes in a sort of stream of consciousness about everything he sees or that he didn't see that he was expecting to see, where, the bird song that he can hear and so on. And because it covers such a long arc of time, you can draw out from it the emergence of some species and the decline of others. And volunteers on the Green Pledge project are busy extracting this kind of data from his journals, and the British Trust for Ornithology are very interested and will be sharing it with them. So that's a really good outcome for the project. Bannister also wrote a chapter for Flora of Gloucestershire on the impact of war agriculture on a specific species. I mean, he was very niche, but so that's worth looking at if you're picking up a copy of Flora of Gloucestershire. On the left-hand side of the slide is the first public meeting of the Gloucestershire Nature Conservation Group, and that was founded in 1960s by, guess who, Peter Scott. Here he is popping up again. And these are people who also saw the damage that wartime agriculture and particularly post-war agriculture, when practices intensified, and they saw the damage of new housing and road building and seeing what that was doing to local wildlife. So that they came together and they just started to take actions. They were doing things like putting in nest boxes and leasing ancient woodland and opening nature reserves and so on. Let's have a look at some individuals. You may well, if you're a local, have come across John Moore, who is a pioneer, was a pioneer conservationist from Gloucestershire. He's from Tewkesbury, and he campaigned for decades on a huge range of environmental issues. But what's really interesting about him is not that he did that, but that he was so far ahead of his time. You can see this letter in the 1950s, and he is a letter to the editor of the local paper, and he's saying, "I'm sorry to say I told you so, but he's saying, I have been writing for a very, very long time to warn against the use of weed killers on roadside verges." Now, I mean, he's writing well before Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, but he could see the damage of this indiscriminate use of weed killers. And he said, I've been writing to for 3 years, but everything's been ignored until then. But I can happily report that these days that is not the situation anymore. The council now works alongside Gloucestershire Wildlife Trust to support biodiversity around the country, and we don't use spray on the verges anymore. So progress. I wish he'd been here to see it all. Who else? This is quite melodramatic. Shades of XR here. This is a anti-pollution campaign in Gloucester by the Young Liberals group in 1972. You can, it's a bit difficult to see, but there's a person lying in a coffin in the centre of the photo. There are a group of pictures from this demonstration. Some of them include a dolly bird and bikini, which just sort of makes me put your head in my hands. But certainly, they managed to grab attention for their cause. There was a lot of coverage of this in the paper. So another one that we've really enjoyed looking into on this project is a late 1980s tree protest. This was the first successful campaign to save trees from being felled for the purposes of road widening. A large supermarket, who would remain nameless, wanted to straighten a road for better access in Stroud, and it was going to take out these beautiful trees in Stroud Stratford Park. So a group came together and they did gosh, I can't remember how many weeks, about 8 weeks round the clock vigil, treetop vigil. And the police couldn't get them down, and there's nor could the security and nor could the local councillors, and they succeeded. So it's a really, really lovely story. Right, we're running out of time, so I will just spend the last few minutes kind of just talking about how our thinking has again moved on in the 21st century. But I'm not going to say that much because you will be able to find out so much more if you come along on the 5th of July and hear from the Gloucestershire Wildlife Trust, who are the real experts on this era from 1992, the Rio Earth Summit, and into today. So they'll be talking about the work that the Gloucestershire Wildlife Trust has done and is going to do on into the future. So there's various things that happened in the early 2000s. There was further strengthening and extending of our legislation, but the principal shift is about the move from conservation, sort of trying to preserve things, to active restoration and enhancement of habitats and ecosystems. Essentially, what we were doing was a case of sort of too little, too late. There's also been innovations in planning for building developments that properly integrate our needs and nature's needs. So we'll just have a quick look at some of those before we wrap up. So nature recovery zones and nature recovery networks. This is really one of the most important aspects of sort of the thinking these days. It's about whole landscapes, really working with whole landscapes, not just little pockets of conservation that were problematic for the nature they were meant to preserve, because nature doesn't just live in one little tiny spot. It needs to be able to move around beyond that. So really what we're trying to do is create these priority areas called, and very large priority areas called nature recovery zones, and connect them up nationally into great vast networks. So what you're getting is essentially a sort of vast wildlife friendly sort of super reserve, rather than these little pockets. So all this thinking was sort of moved on in the wake of a report independently commissioned as the Lawton report of 2010. And the official title was Making Space for Nature, a review of England's wildlife sites and ecological network. So he's really just assessing how effective were these sort of wildlife sites that we already had. And his conclusion was that it really didn't sort of present a very coherent ecological network. And what he called for in his report was a step change to sites that were bigger and better and more joined up. So that's the direction of travel, and that's what you'll hear being talked about. At the moment, Gloucestershire's got 10 of these priority areas called nature recovery zones, and they cover getting on for 70,000 hectares of land. So they're pretty vast. I mentioned to you that things are shifting again in planning. Eco-engineering is another one of these new words that's getting bandied around. This is very much about balancing those needs, the needs of nature and humans, in a way that is viable and sustainable for both. And a new sort of green infrastructure framework, if you will, called Building with Nature, has been launched in 2018. And it came out of a knowledge transfer partnership between Gloucestershire Wildlife Trust and University of the West of England. And that's been piloted in various developments, housing schemes and commercial facilities. So it's been sort of quite, well refined since then. And it's being used in Cirencester for their new house building scheme of somewhere north of 2,000 new houses being built on the southern edge of Cirencester. That's called the Steadings. But on the slide, this is the master plan for the Steadings, and you can see various green features. There's a heritage meadow, there's a landscaped area for play, there are cycle and pedestrian routes, there's parkland and landscaping. There is just more space around all the properties than if I had side by side with that something from the 60s, you would see a really marked difference. And the other thing is it's not just urban sprawl. We've really come a long way from that. This is an entire functioning community with schools, health centres and workspaces. So hopefully with that and all the support for nature in it, that will be a really successful development. So just my last slide now. I just want to reflect as we come to a close here about the ever greater public awareness of the importance of protecting the environment. We've come really, really long way since the 1800s and even since the 1960s in terms of people's understanding, their awareness, and their involvement. I think we have a greater sense of responsibility at the personal and the public level for the environment, and all of those shifts in attitudes and thinking have manifested themselves in the Environment Act of 2021, and that tries to enshrine environmental protection into law in order to improve air and water quality, to improve biodiversity, and to reduce waste. And it sets targets for nature recovery, and it tries to halt and reverse the decline of species within the next 5 years. So some quite challenging targets. But it puts responsibilities on businesses and local authorities too around sustainability and accountability. And there's a new environmental watchdog to oversee that. And it also, like some of the just the immediate post-war legislation, it puts power in the hands of local decision makers to do what's right for their environment locally. So you'll probably hear about local nature recovery strategies, and there are 48 of those and counting at the moment. So it's a really hopeful piece of legislation, and the Environment Secretary, perhaps tooting his own trumpet at the time, he called it the most ambitious environmental programme of any country on earth. And so it's been called as a turning point for nature, and I mean, let's very much hope that's the case. But it will be Okay, so watching this space, I think. But I will bring us to a close there as we are out of time. And you will hear more about that sort of 21st century picture on the 5th of July. So we've got the booking link in the chat there, but I will say thank you very much for listening. And if you could stay on, we've got about a minute for any questions. Although I'm happy to stay on longer if people want to.
Thank you so much, Marion. That was absolutely fascinating. I'm sure we found that so interesting. We've had a couple of nice comments saying very informative and interesting presentations. Thank you very much for that. I'm just checking to see, but I think we haven't got any questions, which just leaves me to mention the fact that the archives, Gloucestershire Archives, have actually been nominated for a fantastic award. It's the Archives and Records Association Award for Record Keeping Service of the Year. I believe that Katie, thank you, Katie, perfectly timed, has just popped up. Katie is our tech person. Well done, Katie, popping up the link so that you can nominate us. She's also going to send that out, I believe, as well. But thank you. If you could nominate us, we would most appreciate it. So that really just leaves us to say thank you again to Marion. Thank you to all of you for joining us this afternoon, and we look forward to seeing you next month. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.